Practice value has a lot to do, or the majority of practice value is based on the net income of that practice. So if your expenses are high, that practice is going to be worth less than a practice making the same amount of money that has lower expenses. So we look at valuation in several different ways. We look at both the income approach and the market approach. The asset approach is usually only used if you have a brand new practice, lots of equipment, and no patients. So we would look at both those approaches to valuation, and then we would make sure that the buyer is able to pay all the bills and still make a living, and that would help you determine what the practice is worth.
Practices vary around the country, but on average, if we look at national statistics, about 62.5% is the number that we'll see nationally. If you look at California, you might see valuations in some of the bigger cities near the 80%, 85, even 90% range, which doesn't work for most of the country. Rural practices can be as low as 50% of the last year's collections. So there is a range depending on where we are, but on balance, I'd say if you looked at 62, 63% of collections, you're going to be really close.
What we do a little different than anybody else is we do a 12 months cash flow spreadsheet. We put the income on our spreadsheet from what the last 12 months. Then we plug in a bank payment, rent, utility, maintenance, lab fees, phone postage and accounting, office supplies, dental supplies. We come up with a buyer's net. Now, buyer's net is not a seller's net, because on a seller's net, you don't have a bank payment. So we want to make sure that the buyer's net is sufficient. For example, if a practice is doing $700,000 and the buyer's net is $70,000, and we have another practice doing $700,000 and the buyer's net is $250,000, which practice is worth more? Obviously, the practice collecting $250,000 is worth more. So that's the important part of doing a cash flow analysis. Then we go out and view the practice. We videotape it, put digital photos, put it on our website. Every practice I've been to since 1978, I've had on videotape, so I can compare the practices I'm looking at to the practices I sold. And doing this for 40 years, from Santa Barbara to San Diego, I'm within a mile of a practice I sold comparable to the practice I'm looking at. So we have market approach, comps, and return of investment approach to see what the doctor is going to put in his pocket after he pays a payment to the bank, and all the true expenses. We kick out the add-backs like depreciation, amortization, travel, car expenses. Then what's really important is after we come to our price, we turn it over to our 3 qualified salespeople. Then after we find a buyer, we turn it over to our loan coordinator, internal loan coordinator, which will do the buy-sell agreement, do the lease assignment, everything we need to do. He's the seller's feet in getting things done, so we save the seller a lot of money, not have to do all these changes on the buy-sell, the allocations, these type of things. Then, after we find the qualified buyer, we follow our buyers for 12 months after we sell a practice. We're the only company that does that as far as I know. So to make sure that the buyer does what we project. In other words, if the seller did $700,000, like I mentioned earlier, we want the buyer to do at least $700,000 or better. And if he doesn't do what we project, then we bring in a practice management person at our expense to find out why. Why did that buyer not do what we project? And usually it's not the buyer, it's the staff that didn't transfer their allegiance to the buyer. So if we want to make sure on their transition process that the staff is on board for the new buyer. And that's another thing that we do, is we put in our listing agreement that the buyer will be acceptable to seller. So the seller can pick the buyer he thinks is going to treat his patients better than anybody else. So that key that the buyer will be acceptable to seller is so important. My older doctor, as soon as I say that, they say, where do I sign? Because they can pick their successor, and that is so important in this business.
How much is your practice worth? Your practice is worth whatever the buyer is willing to pay for it and whatever you're willing to accept. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. We like to look at the practice as a whole and then put a value on it and find out if that value is acceptable to you. But as a norm, your practice is probably going to be worth, depending in the area that you're in, could be anywhere from 60 to 75% of your gross.
Well, I don't really know. Everyone thinks they have an idea of what it's worth, but we generally do a fairly comprehensive study about that. Being part of the ADS group and also the data that we've collected over the last 20 years, we think we have a pretty good idea of what most practices should sell for in each of the kinds of markets that we work in, whether it's a big practice or a small practice or a rural practice or a metro practice. We have some data to suggest what that might sell for, and certainly think we're pretty capable of going through the financials too and seeing what kind of price your practice can support.
A lot of dentists that don't realize that their practice has so much value. They feel like they've slowed down or they have a small practice, and sometimes you'll hear about them just walking away or closing the door. Call your local dental broker to find out, hopefully an ADS broker, to find out what your practice is worth, and you might be surprised at the value of your practice, what you've built up all these years.
Many dentists ask me how much is my practice worth, and honestly, one would never know how much a practice is worth until it's sold, because the very definition of fair market value of a dental practice or a business is when both buyer and seller agree and nobody's under any compunction to buy or sell, and they both agree on the price of the terms. So even a practice valuation or a business valuation might yield a fair market opinion of value. The practice may or may not sell at that price.